Hey guys, welcome to another video. This is going to be the first in a three-part series on gluten. What is gluten? Why is it so bad for you? What does it do? How do you recover from any symptoms that you're experiencing because of gluten, right? So I do have notes here that I've made. I've made notes here just so I don't forget the important points that I need to make. All right. So let's start off with what is gluten? What grains have gluten? Gluten is a protein. Okay. So gluten is found in barley, rye, oats, wheat, and spelt. There's a disclaimer, not all oats have gluten. Oats on their own are a gluten-free grain. Okay, they're gluten-free cereal. Now, oats have a substance called avenin that could mimic the effect of gluten in the body. Another reason why people say oats are not gluten-free is because oats are typically cross-contaminated, either in the same field or in the same processing facility. Uh, but typically oats are gluten free. Just make sure that wherever you get your oats from, make sure that company has a gluten free processing facility, and that way you can get gluten free oats. So like I said, barley, rye, wheat, spelt. Now wheat is the biggest one. A lot of carbohydrates in our world today are wheat derived. Okay, now you have to understand where wheat comes from. Wheat, so this is pre-agricultural revolution. Okay, so wheat was selectively bred by farmers basically. um, Before wheat was cultivated on this mass scale, a wheat berry, a grain, we call them wheat berries. So a wheat berry would have up to 80% protein, and the rest was starch. So the wheat berry originally was extremely nutritious and full of protein, right? Now, gluten is also a protein, but gluten makes up 75% of the protein content in a wheat berry. Now, the wheat berry is gonna have 13% protein overall. 13% protein is what the wheat berry is made of. Out of that 13%, 75 is made of gluten. So the actual absorbable amount of protein that you're getting from the wheat berry is extremely, extremely low. Now, what is gluten? Gluten is a protein made up of two aminos. One is glutenin and one is gliadin. So if you look at wheat flour, it's not mungy and sticky, but when you add the water, the glutenin and the gliadin combine and they make this super hard molecule. Okay? So this molecule is typically larger for the body to digest, and it's very hard. Why? Because it's a protein. Proteins are hard to digest by the body. So why is also wheat so bad? So out of all the crops that are cultivated on the planet, sorry, excuse me, I should say out of all the cereals, out of all the grains that are cultivated on the planet, 25% of that land mass is allocated to wheat cultivation. That's an insanely large amount of land that is allocated to just wheat. Now, because it's produced on such a large scale, it's a huge business. Okay? So, and farmers want efficient yield of their crops. So, of course, some of you have heard of Monsanto and the use of pesticides. So, Monsanto, in their very famous pesticide Roundup, use glyphosate. What is glyphosate? Glyphosate is a substance that is toxic. Our bodies cannot break down this glyphosate. What it does is it helps the plants, the crop, dry quicker without destroying the plant. So it helps it dry quicker by 2 weeks. So basically, they're shortening the yield time by 2 weeks for a wheat harvest. So Roundup and glyphosates are used to spray these crops, and these glyphosates get into our bodies, and our bodies cannot digest, break these particles down, this crazy substance. They're associated with cancer, tumors, all kinds of crazy stuff, all right? Gluten is insoluble in water. It's insoluble in water. Okay? Now, one of the proteins that make up gluten, gliadin, is alcohol soluble. Just throwing that out there, just to know, because later on we're going to be doing a video on how to detox and how you'd be taking perhaps a vodka shot and sitting in the sauna with, a vodka shot with on an empty stomach with a little activated charcoal to start cleansing and detoxing the body, and using the alcohol as a solvent for a lot of the gunk that's stuck in your body. All right, so we're going to touch on that later. So I'm going to post a link down in the description by the US National Library of Medicine that details the evolution of wheat and why was wheat okay in, say, the 1700s, and why is wheat not okay today. All right, so all right, I guess I should go on to gluten-free grains. An option, or many options for people who are either gluten intolerant or have celiac disease, are rice. Rice is amazing. It's gluten free. There's quinoa, there's corn, there's millets, there's buckwheat. Now, in spite of the name buckwheat, it's not related to wheat, and it does not have gluten in it. All right. So I recommend going into what grains you can eat. Typically, I would recommend sticking to simple carbohydrates. Okay, nothing over the top. Rice is amazing. Rice digests really clean. White rice will digest quicker than brown rice, just because brown rice has more fiber, and the body is going to take time to break off that fiber and then access the carbohydrate. So that way it could be slower digesting, but because it has the bran, which is the husk, and right, the shell, because it has the bran and the endosperm in it, it could be longer digesting, and some people could get irritation from eating brown rice. Otherwise, yeah, so that's the gist of gluten and what it is. It's made up of two proteins, glutenin and gliadin. So wheat flour, like I was saying, does not become sticky unless you add water. So the water is going to make that sticky. So how do you identify if a food, in spite of it being made with wheat, is higher in gluten or lower in gluten? Now, bread. When you bake bread, you let it ferment using yeast, right? So the yeast is going to create these little tiny bubbles. That's what gives the fluff to the bread. What's going to hold that bubble in place? It's the glue. The glue is the gluten. It's like a matrix. It's like a matrix, and it swells up, and then the air gets trapped inside here. So each of those tiny bubbles is closed with part of the gluten matrix, which is the glue that holds it together. So in spite of being made of wheat, a flatbread would not have as much gluten as a bread that is fluffy and has risen. So examples would be like your roti, your Arabic bread, right? They won't be as high in gluten as regular white bread or even brown bread. Now, also important to note, sprouting. Sprouting grains, nuts, and seeds is an ancient practice that will change your life. All right? Now, if you sprout any of this gluten containing grains, barley, rye, wheat, spelt, it's going to reduce the gluten content by up to 47%. Now, not to say that you're not going to have any effect, negative effects from gluten after sprouting. You're going to drastically minimize the effects of irritation from gluten. All right? So consider sprouting beans, nuts, and seeds. Quinoa, in spite of it being used as a grain conventionally, is actually known as a pseudo grain, meaning what? It's a seed, like millets, right? They're seeds, or beans, they're seeds. Okay, but I eat beans and I get bloating. Sprout your beans. Don't get the canned shit. Buy your beans raw, unpasteurized, meaning they're dry, but they're not dead. As soon as you introduce them to water, you soak them overnight, they're going to sprout, right? So sprouting removes something known as phytic acid or phytase. It's an enzyme inhibitor. So now you got this little bean, okay? This is a bean right here. And inside the bean is all the nutrients, but it's dry. Now you can store this bean on the shelf for what, 2 years? But that bean's sleeping, it's not dead. So after 2 years, if you put it in a bowl of water overnight, it's going to swell up and it's going to sprout. Now that bean wasn't dead, it was sleeping, it was dormant. So what activated that bean? The water. The water negated the effects of phytase or phytic acid, which was the enzyme inhibitor. It was keeping all of those nutrients locked. It was keeping the bean in a sleep. Now, once you introduce water into it, it broke up that phytase. It released all of those nutrients and elicited growth. So these phytates or phytic acid have a very similar effect in the body. Now, because they're so strong to inhibit an enzyme in a seed which is full of life, it's waiting to grow. It'll create a tree, right? Like a walnut will create a tree that's insane. So it's full of life and it's full of chi, life force, but it's sleeping. So these enzyme inhibitors allow it to sleep. As soon as you sprout it or add water and let it sit, the water breaks up that enzyme inhibitor and releases those nutrients. So by consuming a lot of these phytates, which are in abundance in wheat, because commercially no one's sprouting wheat. No one's going to sprout wheat unless you buy something like Ezekiel bread, which is made with, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 grains that have been sprouted. Super nutritious Ezekiel bread, like the name suggests, it's ancient. So the ancient art of sprouting, it's a secret. It's a forgotten secret. Our grandparents or great-grandparents used to sprout grains, right? So even if you're eating your almonds, sprout them. Many people don't like the texture of a sprouted almond. Okay, soak it overnight and let it dry. Soak a whole bunch, put it in a tray, get like a cheesecloth or something over it, let it dry. After wetting it or sprouting it and drying it, you've negated the phytates. So now it's completely different. It's more digestible. It's not going to cause bloating and gas and stomach irritation, itching, things like that. So consider sprouting your grains. Consider going gluten-free right after this video. I will continue soon with the next two parts of this series. But as of now, do your research on gluten. Okay? And awesome. Thanks for watching. And I'll see you soon for part two. Awesome.